Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Castillo, Marketing Communications Specialist for HR Green. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, What the FCC's Tough New Preemption Order Means for Your Community. Today's webinar is being brought to you by HR Green, and in the next hour, you'll learn about how, despite the new FCC legislation, local governments can maintain authority and flexibility. The discussion will focus on how local governments can establish reasonable regulations and public policies governing small cell deployments. Before I turn it over to our panelists and jump into the content, let me first provide you with some direction on how to use GoToWebinar. Let's look at GoToWebinar options for a moment. You can show or hide your control panel at the top of the toolbox with the red arrow. You can put your screen in full screen mode by using the rectangle in the upper right corner of the toolbox. Attendees are muted during the webinar, but you can ask a question using your toolbox. To do so, click the plus sign next to questions and type your question. Once you typed it, click send. We'll be taking your questions at the end of your presentation, so feel free to send them in at any time. I'll be your moderator today, and now introduce our presenters. Bart Miller is an attorney. He is had over 30 years at the Colorado Office of Legislative Legal Services, which is the in-house legal counsel for the Colorado General Assembly. His current role is a Colorado local government attorney working for Collins, Cockrell, and Cole. George Wentz has over 40 years of municipal service management experience. He's a former city manager and is currently the deputy city manager in Jurupa Valley, California. He is also the vice president of the governmental services business line at HR Green. And Dave Zelnock has been a public works director for over 20 years at various cities. He's helped install hundreds of miles of municipal fiber infrastructure and is currently a local government services manager at HR Green. Now a little bit about HR Green. We're a multidisciplinary professional services and construction firm offering planning, technical consulting, including 5G small cell deployment, broadband and fiber, engineering, environmental services, and constructions to clients in diverse markets. Founded in 1913, HR Green is one of America's oldest design and construction firms, and we enjoy a long-standing reputation for environmental stewardship, public service, and technical excellence. The firm now employs over 450 people in 8 states and has helped many agencies nationwide in broad-based municipal engineering. Our business lines provide comprehensive services in transportation, water, governmental services, land development, environmental, and construction. Here's our agenda for today. I have it broken into 3 different parts. The first part, we'll talk about federal and state laws, and that'll be presented by attorney Bart Miller. And in part 2, Dave Zelnock will provide an overview about this technology. And in part 3, George Wentz will provide advice on next steps and things that local governments can do to maintain authority and flexibility for small cell rollouts. At the end, I will share any questions that our audience has asked and provide time for our presenters to answer your questions. In addition, you will all receive an email with a recording to the video should you like to watch it again. Now, part 1, I'd like to turn over to Bart Miller, who'll be talking about federal and state law. Bart?
Thank you, Chris. I'm very glad that all of you are able to participate in our webinar today. Welcome. As many of you may know, there is a labyrinth of federal and state laws that affect telecommunications, particularly mobile telephone service. As U.S. mobile telephone service begins to move toward the 5G era, the way these federal and state laws work together will have an effect on the speed and efficiency with which we move toward and into 5G. In this webinar, we will be focusing on how these federal and state laws affect the construction of the physical infrastructure necessary for the next generation of mobile telephone service. Our presenters following me will talk in more detail about the significant differences between small cell infrastructure necessary for 5G and the macro cell infrastructure with which you may already be familiar. In September of this year, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, adopted a declaratory ruling report and order that would enact preemptions of local authority over small cell wireless facility deployment and management of local rights of way. This FCC action is scheduled to take effect on January 14, 2019. But as we will discuss in a few minutes, there is a federal court challenge to the FCC's action that may affect when the FCC decision will take effect and in what form. The new FCC rules will create a shot clock shortening the time cities must process applications for small cells. 60 days for co-location on pre-existing structures, and 90 days for new builds. And the order also codifies existing 90 and 150-day shot clocks for non-small cell wireless facility deployments that were actually established in a similar 2009 FCC declaratory ruling. The order also would limit application fees for small cells and recurring fees that may be charged. The order would also prohibit cities from assessing fees that include anything other than a reasonable approximation of the reasonable costs for processing these types of land use applications. In short, the new FCC rules would severely limit the aesthetic review and other requirements that can be imposed on the siting of these types of facilities. The idea of the new FCC rules is that if a local government limits mobile infrastructure deployment more stringently than the FCC's rules will preempt local authority and allow a telecommunications provider to move forward despite the more stringent local rules. The FCC is doing this under its authority to interpret provisions of federal telecommunications law that bar a local government from taking actions that have the effect of denying telecommunications service to a local area. There has been, as I said a minute ago, a federal court lawsuit filed by numerous local governments in many parts of the country challenging the FCC's shot clock rulemaking. This case is named City of San Jose et al. Versus the FCC. The case was originally filed in the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals on the West Coast, but because numerous municipalities from across the country brought similar suits, the case has been consolidated in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based in Denver, Colorado. The federal courts have a multi-jurisdictional panel that sorts out how to consolidate a challenge like this brought in multiple places across the country. It's kind of like a lottery system, believe it or not. In this situation, that panel decided the case should be consolidated in the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which does have a reputation for being more conservative than the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, and one of the more conservative circuits in the country. This case, the San Jose case, seeks to invalidate the FCC's actions to impose new shot clocks for small cell development. The court could invalidate the FCC's rules. It's not clear if the effective date of the FCC rules will remain January 14, 2019, or be delayed by this federal court action that's been filed. It is also hard to predict if the challengers of the FCC action will ultimately be successful. The FCC decision appears to be well-reasoned and builds on the FCC's 2009 declaratory order imposing shot clocks for macro cell development. This legal challenge is currently in the preliminary stages. In fact, several of the parties to the lawsuit seem to be arguing that the case should be moved back to the 9th Circuit on the West Coast. Ironically, it appears to be the East Coast cities that are arguing the case should go back further west to the 9th Circuit. We'll have to see what happens with this case as it moves forward. I actually checked the federal docket on this case earlier this morning, and the local government plaintiffs in the case have applied for a stay of the January 14th, 2019 effective date of the FCC rules. So we're going to have to see what the federal court ends up doing with that particular motion. It was just filed yesterday, so the FCC and the U.S. government have not had an opportunity to answer that particular motion. In addition to the FCC ruling on small cell development, the states depicted on this particular slide have also passed their own legislation on small cell development. As you can see, these states include Colorado, Illinois, Florida, and Texas, to name just several. A significant number of states, and a complication in addition to the FCC order that is under federal court review that I talked about a minute ago. An example of why this is important for local governments, this whole issue of small cell development, is what has happened in Houston, Texas. And here in this situation, actual small cell applications by 4 wireless entities, only 4, from those applications in a 10-block area, they are asking for 20, yes, that actually is 20, towers, small cell tower facilities to be sited. This is just one city's experience. So local governments are going to increasingly start experiencing requests to site these facilities within their local jurisdiction. In fact, I would think many of you are already experiencing those applications. An example of just one of these state laws is what has occurred here in Colorado, where I am based. Colorado has enacted its own small cell law, House Bill 17-1193. This law went into effect on July 1, 2017. The law provides that it is applicable to any political subdivision or local government entity here in Colorado. The law's deadlines are somewhat different than the new FCC shot clock rules. A Colorado local government under this law is required to process a complete small cell application within 90 days versus 60 days per the FCC order for co-location, replacement, or modification of a small cell facility, and 150 days if the application involves the location of a new structure or new wireless facility, so a new build. A provider under this Colorado law has the right to locate or co-locate small cell facilities in the rights of way owned by our local governments here. And also under this law, our local governments cannot request or receive from a provider in exchange for or as a condition to attach devices to poles any in-kind payment. And the law severely limits the ability of local governments to charge other than the actual cost of processing a land use application. So no ongoing rental of facilities and that type of thing. So very restrictive. A big takeaway here in my mind is that you need to determine what your state is doing with respect to small cell development. Has your state enacted its own laws, imposing deadlines on local governments with land use power? Or is your state relying on the FCC's shot clock rules? A final big legal takeaway here is that it is very likely that the federal government and many states will or will try to limit the ability of local governments to impose traditional local land use restrictions on the development of small cell infrastructure moving forward. So those are some big takeaways.
Thank you very much, Bart. Now for part 2 is Dave Zelnock, and he'll discuss what this technology is all about. Dave?
Chris, thanks, and Bart, great work there with the legal overview. I keep learning things every time, and this morning's news was also enlightening as well. So Bart, thank you. I'd like to say a few words about what this technology is, just to put some context around why all the fuss, where is this going, and kind of what I like to say is why bother. It's no surprise that more and more people are using the World Wide Web, the internet, and we're seeing a huge increase in demand and throughput. The question I would like to ask all of you to maybe walk away with at least one thing, understanding what a small cell is, and understanding that a small cell may not be 5G at this point, but we'll talk about that. So a small cell simply, and usually it's a notebook size, low-powered antenna. Will supplement, and that's an important word. So it will not replace the big macro towers. These are these $1 million, 100-foot towers you see around town. Those big towers have a range to your cell phone of 2 to 3 miles, depends on a lot of things, but those are 3-mile intervals to place it. The small cell towers, in contrast, have a much lower power, but they're going to have a lot higher capacity. Arguably, the quality of the service, the signal that you get will be higher. Resilience is a big deal, so they can be networked together. So if you lose one, you don't lose the whole signal. And offering a whole lot of support for new services, which we'll talk about. So specifically, here's some examples of what some good small cells might look like in your community. So next slide, if you would, Chris. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. So here's
Hey, Dave, a couple participants just asked if you could raise your voice just a little. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Hopefully, is this a little better? Good. Sorry about that.
Yep.
So thank you. The question is, so what is a small cell? Here's some examples of some good small cells. Around the streetlight pole on the left there is a streetlight mast. You can look carefully at the very top of it there by the luminaire or the cobra head is a small transmitter that's on the left side. In the middle, you'll see a cigar tube looking to different streetlights. Although it arguably does clutter up the landscape. And then on the far right-hand side, I've actually overseen the design and negotiations for some of these. Take a traffic signal mast, and we've done some upgrading where the cellular provider has willingly partnered with the city government to include this. I would not say is one of the prettiest ones. We've actually done a little better one, but this is a traffic signal mast with a small cell built into it. So these are, believe it or not, some of the better looking ones. Not so good looking ones. You've already seen one or two examples of those. There we go. In front of your house. And by the way, these do not also include what are called the pedestals. That's the ground equipment. Right now they're used small, like a baseball size green box, usually down by your house or your neighbor's house. The ground equipment for these aerial devices can be huge, the size of a motorcycle or so, again, sitting out in front of your house, buzzing all the time. So it's not just all about the aerial equipment that you see here, but it's also about the ground equipment that supports it. So moving beyond that, the question I would like to pose is, okay, so those are small cells. Okay, so what exactly is this 5G we keep hearing about? By the way, there's a great article in this weekend's Wall Street Journal talking about there was a Chinese electronics executive that was arrested in Canada. Believe it or not, much of that company's, according to the Wall Street Journal, much of that company's concerns was regarding where that company is going with respect to 5G deployment. So you start thinking about, wow, this is really getting pretty big, which is true. So 5G, simply put, is the 5th generation. Right now, many of you are talking or listening to me on a 4G phone. It may be an LTE, a long-term evolutionary LTE phone, but it's really 4G technology. The 5th generation, or 5G, will bring some incredible increases in speed. Right now, if you have a 4G phone, you might get 2 or 3 or maybe up to 20, possibly 30 megabits per second of internet speed. By the way, that may be equal to what you're getting in your house right now, by the way, but you can get 20-ish megabits through a 4G LTE phone. When 5G comes out, the starting point should be about 1,000 megabits. That's known as a gigabit. And then the technology should allow expansion in speed from 1,000 to 20,000. So we'll go from 20 megabits to 20,000 megabits when 5G is fully deployed. That's a huge increase in speed. But even more important, arguably, than speed is the latency. And latency, for example, is when you talk to grandma on the phone, there's sometimes a lag between when you're speaking and the other person is speaking. That's important if you're trying to do brain surgery remotely, telemedicine. Having zero latency or very low latency is very important, to where there's no lag time when you're moving or talking from end to end. and also the ability to connect thousands of devices at one time. Unlike other networks, by the way, 5G will likely require literally thousands, probably millions of small cell antennas around the nation. Not all of them, but the majority of them will ultimately require a connection with a fiber optic cable. You can get some intermediate gain through coax and twisted pair copper and through microwaving to these 5G sites, but the vast majority ultimately will have to be connected with a new fiber optic cable. And that's kind of a foot stopper, because if you're in a city or county or local government, every one of those fiber optic cables, if it doesn't already exist, and it probably doesn't, will have to require a street cut or a cut under a sidewalk, under the parkway, somewhere in the public right-of-way. And so we're not just concerned as much about the aerial aesthetics, but also think about if you have to manage the pavement sections, the thousands of street cuts for these thousands of new antennas in your cities. And we'll talk about that in a little while, but think also beyond that to the millions of dollars in what I call hidden subsidies for the street cut repairs. And so if you say, okay, each small cell tower, and by the way, the spacing on those towers, as I said earlier, is a lot tighter under the new system than the old system, but every one of those will probably have to have one cut or maybe two street cuts per small cell tower. And if you aren't charging, it depends on where you're at and a lot of conditions, but if you aren't charging roughly approaching $1,000 per street cut, you probably are going to be hard pressed to defend why you're subsidizing those street cutters with your inspection services, with your future paving services, and your traffic control, your cone zone. Somebody's got to watch that, and you're investing a lot of your own city's money right now, probably into these hidden subsidies for the street cut repairs. So be thinking about that as well. And then long term, of course, there are the aesthetic concerns that we're talking about. So the telecom trends that we're seeing, again, LTE to 5G, what's really happening? Worst case is that every carrier, imagine this, every carrier may want to have, if you look at Houston, for example, of just the downtown area, and there are 4, maybe 5 different carriers, T-Mobile, Sprint, Verizon, AT&T, and then you have, depending where you're at, you have the other telecoms that may be involved with those things. But imagine that under a worst case scenario, you could have every carrier requesting on the size of the block. It could be every carrier on every block, and the spacing between these towers can be as little as 300 feet. And so you won't have one antenna every 300 feet. Worst case, and this is not likely, but it could be a worst case scenario, you could have 4 or 5 antennas every 300 feet in a heavily urbanized area downtown. Again, 5G will likely require fiber optic feed to every transmitter. And here we go again. Think for just planning purposes, 2 street cuts per small cell. You think 4 small cells per block if each carrier wants one. And look at the hidden subsidies, look at your time and effort that you're doing, not only chasing the permitting of the antennas, but also accommodating the underground infrastructure necessary for those antennas. Bottom line is, we talk about a tidal wave of attachments, a tsunami of antennas that's coming out there. Why bother with all these things? The technology, one good analog or analogous way of putting it is, and I don't like this because I think that black and white to color TV doesn't really capture the huge increase in capacity and capabilities that we'll be seeing when we go from 4G to 5G. But if you're thinking now proactively or acting proactively, there's a possibility, depending on how you do this, yes, you cannot charge, as Bart said, you cannot charge for the pole attachment, but there are ways that could create millions in revenue for you, or millions in cost avoidance or cost reductions. There are ways to control aesthetics if you're smart about this, and you get the jump on these folks. You can reduce costs. You can develop your own fiber optic network, and I'll show you an example of one that I oversaw. And if you like to think about economic development, jobs, there are ways that you can exploit this great opportunity or challenge and turn it into an economic development potential. Talk briefly about repurposing your digital infrastructure. One thing that most cities have is you may own pipes in the ground. You may control how and where and when pipes in the ground are being placed. Would you believe that if your city is one of the few that owns the street lighting infrastructure, there is now a way that you can include a fiber optic cable into the electrical conductor conduit if you have one, and not all streetlights are wired by conduits. A lot of them just have direct burial of their conductors in the dirt. But if you have a conduit there and you own the conduit, believe it or not, the conduit can be more valuable than the streetlights. But it is important to understand the complex interrelationships, the revenue opportunities that we like to think are out there. This fiber optic game is really, I mean, it is at the international level now, and there's a lot of nuances, and you can get burned really quickly. And as Bart just pointed out, it changes daily. So be on your lookout, be on your toes. Talking briefly about streetlights, you know, there's no such thing as it being just a streetlight anymore. We've done a lot of work here, actually, and around the country, talking about municipalizing. I don't like that word, but I think there's a better word: municipalizing street lighting. Around the nation, some estimates are there's 20 to 30 million streetlights. Most of them are not owned by the cities that are paying for them. Rather, in most places, the power company owns a streetlight, and a pretty typical cost per streetlight runs about $20 per month. In California, surprisingly, some of the power companies out there charge maybe $10 to $12 per streetlight per month, but some of them charge up to $30 per streetlight per month. So I like to look at it at every streetlight as a dollar bill dispenser, almost dispensing or charging a dollar bill per day for the pleasure of illuminating a small portion of your city streets. It may not be that much in your city, depends what your power company charges you, but at $20 a month is pretty typical. At $20, it's a $20 bill dispenser every month is the way I like to look at it. If you do take the time and effort to municipalize that infrastructure, and by the way, there are rules and ways you can do that. The power bill, the power component, if you have a high pressure sodium, those are the brown light bulbs, and you don't convert, just take over the bulb as is, take over the fixture as is. You can reduce your cost from $20-ish down to about $2. If you convert that to an LED, you can drop the power consumption to about $1 per month. So right now, you're probably paying $20 a month for really $1 to $2 in power. And so if you're a power company, it's a great deal. If you're a city and you're paying $20 where you're only getting $1 to $2 worth of service or power out of your $20 bill, you might want to rethink that. Some of the situations we've looked at is a 5 to 10 year ROI, and again, there are even more savings with LEDs. The next level, though, be thinking just beyond the municipalization benefits, looking at what are these street lights good for? Well, smart street lights, they're dimmable. They can detect people when they're around them, and they can brighten up. You can control them through emergency responders. You can 5G cellular enable them. You can put transmitters in these things. Digital signage, sensors of all kinds, smoke detectors, pedestrian detectors, gunshot detectors, and put all kinds of sensors on these things. And we like to look at these really not as much as streetlights anymore, but as these remote sensing locations. So what I'd like to do next is talk just briefly about some experience that I've had in one of the Denver, Colorado suburbs called Centennial. I happen to have had the pleasure, it's a brand new city. It was incorporated back in 2002. I happened to be the first ever public works director for several years for this brand newly organized or incorporated city. It's a 100,000 population, about 15 miles east-west. And the map you see here on the screen, every green or red dot is a green or red light. It's a traffic signal. There's about 84 of those dots around the city. In the first year that we started this fiber optic initiative in Centennial, we put in about 3 miles of fiber optic cable. That was under a state highway. We worked an intergovernmental agreement or an IGA with the local highway department, and we were delighted to have 3 miles to interconnect some of our traffic signals. But again, we only had a handful of signals connected, and we had lots and lots more to go. So interestingly, what we learned, though, was that the fiber optic is a lot cheaper than the pipe. The pipe can be $20 per linear foot to install, where the fiber optic cable, you buy the cable for $1 a foot, you install it, you blow it in with compressed air for another $1 per foot. So $20, or maybe 90% of the value of what we did is in the pipe, not the fiber optic cable. So anyway, so this is year one. Chris, pop the slide. Is it better 1 or is it better 2? 4 years later, this is what the map of Centennial looked like with respect to the fiber optic infrastructure. We went crazy in a good way. We did spend about $600,000 public dollars. That's about $2 per foot. And another way to look at it, it's roughly $2 per person. It's 100,000 population. We did this over several years. So it's about $2 per person per year, or population resident per year. So we spent $600,000, and the value of this close to 60 miles of fiber optic infrastructure. Again, we're just talking, this is fiber optic plastic pipe. It's nothing fancy, but we had a great run of putting in miles and miles of it. We put $600,000 of money into it, and the value that we created arguably is somewhere between $10 and $20 million, again, for a $600,000 upfront investment. While that's good, I think the best part, though, is a picture of a billboard that I took recently. So now the city owns 60 miles of fiber optic infrastructure, and voila, a company you've probably never heard of. You've heard of Google Fiber, probably. This is one of Google Fiber's larger competitors, a company called Ting. They are right now, actually this is a billboard in Centennial saying, hey, we are bringing crazy fast fiber internet to Centennial. Come talk to us, we'll sell you gigabit, which is 1,000 megabit fiber optic service to your house, grandma, and you can cut the cord. You can stop your cable TV service if you like, and you can stream in HD at crazy fast speeds all the content that you need to have, and that we think is pretty cool. So, and this is the whole, by the way, this is a whole hour presentation that we don't have time for today, so we'll just kind of skim over that briefly. But the point is, there's a lot of great opportunity if you're proactive and thinking about how can you link these, connect these dots. Here's a picture, by the way, that the city of Centennial did provide us recently. So this is Arapahoe Road. It's a major east-west thoroughfare. This is the road that we did the 3 miles of fiber optic conduit in initially, looking to the west toward the Rocky Mountains. And this is what it looks like today. And then fast forward, if Centennial or city Centennial for their city, so illustrating what their future might be like if you choose deliberately or intentionally take no action. So obviously, no one, I think, would like to clutter up their landscape. I think the last slide I've got is just talking about, okay, what can or what should you do in a case like this? Would you like to own fiber optic cable under every street in town? Think about that. Could you, and before you answer that, assume that somebody else is paying 90% of your costs. That's what we did for in and with Centennial. The little picture on the right there is a picture of a traffic signal that I think I mentioned earlier, that we did work with local telecommunications companies. They were what's called a span wire, which is just a wooden pole with arm, so it's got the black arm going over, and within that vertical pole you can see there is hidden a small cell transmitter. We got this is probably a $60,000 to $80,000 capital upgrade to one of the traffic signal pieces of infrastructure there, and this is all by working proactively, which we did successfully. And this is one example of what you can do if you're ahead of the game, if you understand how the game is played, and you can work with these people proactively. So the question is, beyond that, could your city and citizens benefit from low-cost gig-speed broadband? I think they probably could. There is definitely an economic development benefit for that. One study that I saw showed a 3% increase in house value for a house that's connected with a fiber optic cable compared to a house not. So.
Hey, Dave, I think we just lost you there for
2000. Oh, I'm sorry. Still there? I'm sorry.
Oh, yep. Now you're back. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Anyway, so the bottom line is, can you better manage all the aerial and underground infrastructure? Think about concealing this equipment. Think about those streets. They are incredibly valuable. If you don't own them, we suggest that you consider ways to municipalize that. We can help you with that, of course. And think about these as being future transmitter sites, reducing the cost for lighting, and in effect, creating a strategic plan. This very difficult, rapidly changing situation. So with that, Chris, I'll turn it back to you. Sorry about the audio problems, and I'm sure George will have some pearls of wisdom to share.
Yeah. The next part is talking about next steps is George Wentz. George?
Yeah, appreciate that very much, Chris, and Dave, thank you. First of all, let me just thank everyone for your attention, both to the legal and technical aspects of what we've been discussing today and its impact on your local agencies. I just wanted to take the next several minutes to summarize a bit of what you've heard and then close our formal part of our presentation today, and then allow some time for some questions. So here's some food for thought. Cities, at least perceptually, have a image problem to some extent, partly because they seem to be ones who can be at times obstacles to business and winning the race for 5G rather than innovators. I don't necessarily agree with that, but sometimes that is the perception, the image that's created out there if we're not proactive, and in fact, if we're not responsive to what we see coming up within the industry. So part of the way to counteract that is to assure that our elected officials, for example, are well educated and they understand the potential impact of the offing that's coming, and that we need to strengthen our own policies and procedures. As was said earlier, we have a shot clock oftentimes imposed upon us, but I think we can overcome that by really putting in our own internal shot clock so we can address this effectively in terms of how do we best respond to this and how to deploy it within our own areas. And then certainly there is still a bumpy road ahead, as you heard some of the discussion on the challenges as far as the FCC imposing this decision upon us, but there's still some actions we should be taking regardless of what happens. I think as we look ahead, we just need to be proactive and take actions that really impact our communities in a positive way. You heard Dave talk a bit earlier about Centennial, and then and how we can leverage our assets, if you will. And it's really, I think, an interesting study because it's just demonstrated to be a way to create new partnerships and perhaps alternate ways of funding some of our projects and to try to manage them at the lowest possible cost. So you need to make sure that you accurately define what you own, understand those assets, and to seek mutual benefit wherever you can. And we just suggest again that you work with your local providers now to demonstrate the benefits of what that cooperation can be. So let me just talk briefly here about some of the ways we can develop a small cell policy. As you heard again earlier, the term shot clock is going to be something you're going to hear over and over and over again. To me, it's a matter of how you apply that word and how you can benefit from it. As you can see from the list that you have before you on this slide, there's a number of key tasks that you should really be considering to implement to protect yourself. Let me just allow you a short time to read these. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but put simply, they're just, in our opinion, the elements to success. And whether they're policies or whether they're standards or whether they're processes, please take the time to identify them and to complete the effort so that you will simply be able to control what's ahead of you. And don't forget some of the restrictions that may be upon you, but you can also take those and work them to your advantage. So what's some of the discussion items related to decision making? Probably one of the best things that you can do is really make some of the decisions ahead of time and look forward. Visioning and strategy are always critical, and again, understanding the assets that you have before you. So decide now and then put those strategies into place. As you can see from this slide again, we highly recommend that you know what those assets are, where they're relocated, and know what your costs are. As Dave mentioned earlier, it will be critical to be able to substantiate what those costs are, so you're in fact not subsidizing the industry, but in fact the industry is paying for its own costs and the impacts that they're going to have upon your community. In a way, if this FCC ruling holds, they could be perceived as taking advantage of the local communities. But I think if we're smart and we deal with this effectively, we can counteract that ourselves and have a positive impact in our communities, knowing what's coming and then dealing with it. Dave talked about some of the technical aspects again. He used the term municipalization, although it's perhaps a $6 million word, it is also an important thing to understand that we can take control of those streetlights, whether they're owned by us or not. We can work with the local power company to address some of the potential impacts upon not just the streetlights, but upon what they look like within our community. An important aspect of what we, again, can look at is our own street cut programs within our city, to understand what those real costs are and to assure that the street cutters are, in fact, paying for the cost of services as they may be relating to that new program that comes through your city. Make sure that your management systems, in fact, do control and you have understanding of what's happening with your own facilities. If you have a GIS, we suggest that 3D is really the best way to go. Some of the things, as we're hearing now within the industry, there's actually offers to assure that that GIS is kept up to date at no cost to cities, because it benefits the industry as well as the local community to have a good description of what those assets are, how they're being impacted, and what the community needs to do to make sure that everything's really under control. In the longer term, I just put a few, I guess, buzzwords up there: explore, facilitate, encourage, and monetize. These are just intended to, I guess, jog your memory and your minds to try to assure that you are doing the best jobs you can as an entity to work with the private sector and take advantage of those opportunities within the public and private sector relationships, so that in fact we can create some positive, if you will, benefit to both parties, assure that you can facilitate access to some of our public places and how they're used, and to manage those effectively. I think the private sector will also be willing to make investments within our communities if they understand how they benefit from those investments. And if the time is taken now, regardless of what the FCC does, to control what's happening within our communities. From a monetary point of view, we all have various types of franchise agreements that we need to review, have a better understanding of what we may be able to do within those franchise agreements with some of our providers. Oftentimes it's with our power companies. It's also sometimes within our cities related to our providers of our cell services that I've seen as well. So make sure there's a good understanding of how that can, again, benefit your particular city. So some suggested next steps that we encourage you to do. We believe all of the agencies really need to have a champion to assure within the entity that you have someone who is up to date, keeps up to speed with what's going on, and is allowed to dedicate some time to this particular effort, understand your systems, and develop your own internal common strategy so you know where you're going with this. We're seeing now more discussion and requests from us as well to help develop an action plan for city councils so that they understand what the real impact upon this is, so they can work on policies, set them up within a particular city, so that there is in fact a master plan that leverages the benefit we can take as a community within this particular FCC ruling. Our suggestion is to make sure that you seek help where necessary. That can be coming from a lot of different sources, but the one key point takeaway is that you really should not delay what you're doing, because in a way, although not legally a mandate, there is going to be a need for each agency to figure out how they're going to fund this, how they're going to react to it, and address the legal aspects of this order as well. So with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it back to you for any questions that may be out there and final closing remarks.
Thank you, George. We did get some questions. I'm just going to ask them in the order they came. The first one was from Drew, and he asked, which regulations take precedent, the FCC order or the state law?
Well, it sounds like a legal question, Bart.
Yeah.
Can we pose on you to answer that one?
You want me to take that one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. It's going to depend on the decision of the federal courts in the case that is currently going on, the San Jose case. And right now, the FCC order is not in effect, and if the federal courts grant a stay of their order, then that order will not come into effect until after the federal courts make a final decision in the case. But ordinarily, if you have an economic regulation of some kind, and it is legitimate under something called the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the federal law or rule, whatever it is, will have priority over a state law. But in the absence of a federal law on something, then state laws dealing with economic types of issues would have primacy in terms of regulation.
All right, thanks, Bart. Anyone else, or I can move on to the next question here. The next question is by Peter, and he says, why is the FCC requiring this build out, and why is this not driven by the private sector?
Read that again, Chris. I'm not quite sure I understood the question.
Sir, he says, why is the FCC requiring this, this build out, and why is this not being driven by the private sector?
I can answer. I can answer part of it. In the FCC's order that they issued back in September, they really aren't mandating a build out. What they are doing is trying to stop what they consider to be obstacles the private sector may encounter in going forward with the build out to 5G.
Yeah, so this is George. I think just quickly also, I think the private sector, in fact, may be driving part of the FCC order in that they want to eliminate as many obstacles as they can from their ability for this 5G build out. So in my opinion, it's kind of working both sides of this two-edged sword, trying to get the best of both worlds, to have some authority to be able to move forward. At the same time, it's my opinion that the private sector is willing to make the contribution if the local entities are willing to work with them.
Mm-hmm. George, you're absolutely right. The one thing, George, that you touched on that I'll share, my understanding that I guess one of the either best or worst examples is Florida, I guess depending on your perspective, because I think what Bart and George were both intimating at is that these private companies have been so good at what they're doing, they've gone to the federal level, the FCC, to get them to push for this blanket authority, and they've worked with, to varying degrees, 20 states. You saw the map earlier in our presentation. Florida, from what I understand, for example, if you own a traffic signal, for example, or a telephone pole, which is city-owned, not only, and then a telecom comes along and says, look, we want to hang our 5G small cell transmitter on your pole. If your pole in Florida will not withstand the weight of it, you, the city, you, the power provider, the public entity, is required to upgrade at your expense the pole so it will carry the extra weight and the extra wind resistance from the extra equipment that you don't even own and you can't even charge for. So when it comes to maybe an extreme example of how crazy some of these laws, I think, that's my opinion, can get, go look at Florida and be on the lookout. The municipal leagues, the state legislatures, and Bart used to work for the Colorado legislature, has got to be on your toes and taking input from cities to have a different perspective on this. But that's the evolution of laws in our nation. Great question.
All right, we do have a few more questions coming in. One is from Tom. He said, can we require the telecom companies to utilize municipal-owned facilities to mount their antennas?
Great question. Not necessarily, but we are working, for example, with some clients where we like to say that look, you can have it the easy way or the hard way, and there are some strategies and techniques that cities can do to make it so easy, so comfortable, so quick, painless, and low cost that the telecoms would be crazy not to go easy and go onto a city facility which has been prepped. One example is if the city owns fiber optic infrastructure and they say, look, here's a bell tower. Think of it that way. In our city, we'll make use of you can make use of the bell tower for free. Would rather have you go there where it's hidden rather than having your crap hanging on our power poles all over town. And so there are strategies where you can voluntarily encourage them to locate where we find where it's easy versus hard. It's just the path of least resistance, and there are ways you can work with them to encourage them. You can't mandate them, but you can encourage them. Hope I've answered the question.
Thanks, Dave. I have another question from Ann. She asks, how will existing cell sites and distributed antenna systems sites tie into the new 5G, or they become obsolete?
Really depends. What's amazing is some of these macro towers are not even fed even today. Many of them, a large percentage of them, of the macro towers are not even fed by fiber optic cables. And so really this is going to be an evolutionary process. It'll depend on the manufacturer of the specific small cell transmitter. It'll depend on the network you're dealing with. Verizon will have a different strategy than T-Mobile. Some will double up. Some will refuse to work with others, but ultimately you'll see this kind of peppering of replacements going on. A lot of equipment coming down, but a lot more of it really going up, depending on does T-Mobile pick brand X and does Verizon pick brand Y for their equipment. And some equipment will be more compatible, and some equipment will be cheaper. Some will have longer range, lower cost benefits. It really, really, really depends. One of the points I think George is making is that every city is unique. One size will not fit all, and that really is true for how cities should be approaching this, and also how the telecoms will be approaching this, because it really depends on a lot of technical data out there. Frequencies is a big deal, so that the two frequencies don't overlap. You can't have towers in some cases too close because they'll bleed over and interfere with each other. So there's a lot of technical nuances here. Again, I think one of our overarching pieces of advice is to get some advice. So, yeah.
All right, thanks, Dave. The questions they keep coming in. We have another one from Paul, and he asks if we have any information about how this order will affect historic districts, i.e. review.
That's a great question, Bart. I have not heard. That's a very good question. Thoughts, Bart?
That is a good question. I think if the federal courts uphold what the FCC has put out now, it has the potential for overriding historic districts, because this would be a national preemption of that. So I believe that's kind of the direction it goes. And I hope that answers that. Now, obviously, the federal case that's going on has thrown the FCC's order into question here, so that's not going to be happening at least instantaneously.
All right, thanks, guys, for answering that one. We just have a couple more, which is great because we do have a few more minutes. This question is: what if our city's costs for processing applications exceed the FCC's limit? Do we lose money at that point?
That's an excellent question. One thing that George touched on briefly was a cost of service study. So the FCC rules, and Bart, kick me here across the phone lines if I stray too far here, but my understanding is the FCC rules say that unless you can demonstrate that your charges are reasonable, then, and most cities can't right now because most cities don't have what's often called a cost of service study. If you don't have a cost of service study, and those aren't that expensive to do, but you need to have some documentation. One of George's points also was you should have electronic plan check and electronic plan review. So if you're a Verizon, you come in, you submit your plan requests electronically, they're reviewed electronically, and kicked back out. That's arguably one of the less expensive, fastest way to go, we think, so you don't have paper floating around. But unless you can demonstrate that these are your costs, and again, the way to demonstrate that, we think the best is to have a study that documents it, you're stuck with dozens of dollars that you can charge for each permit, depending on, again, as Bart pointed out, the costs and the shot clocks there. So the foot stopper, one takeaway messages here is that if you don't have documentation, we're happy to help you do that. Look at your true costs of service and then pin your permitting costs to your true cost of service. And by the way, you heard me talk earlier about these street cuts. You should be doing the same thing, not just for what does it cost you to process a small cell permit, but think about what does it cost you to process a street cut permit, and then the pavement degradation. What's the cost of repairing in the future the pothole or not the subsidy, but if the pavement will subside in the future? You can hit them up front for the future pavement degradation, for the true cost of the street cut, and the true cost of the permit. So those are all costs you should be thinking about. And I'm talking probably a couple $1,000 is not unreasonable if you can demonstrate, again, because you've got document, because you've got a cost of service study. So that's very crucial, but it's a great question.
And I think that's a distinction, Dave, between the cost of the permit and processing it through this order versus the impact and the cost on the infrastructure. I think that will be an argument that will be made related to this overall order in itself.
Good point, George.
All right.
And I agree with the part no, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Finish.
I was going to say I agree with what Dave and George have said. The FCC's order does not set a specific cost. It just is a reasonable cost. So I think, doing a study and determining what your actual costs are is probably the key to dealing with that.
All right, thanks, Bart. We have two more questions that just came in, and we should have time before the bottom of the hour here. The first one is from Michael. He said, are there any health risks or health risk concerns with the new towers?
Ooh, that depends on who you ask, how you ask the question, and what's your understanding of the nature of RF or radio frequency. It's radiation. Arguably the sun is irradiating the Earth constantly, and arguably there are RF concerns out there. Officially, the official federal statement is no. There's nothing to be worried about out there. But George and I were actually talking to a new client in California just the other day, and one of my first questions was okay, you're just looking at getting into this. Let me ask you all this. You're the city officials. Do you have a constituency, an organized constituency of people who are advocates either for or against these things? Because I've seen cities spend months and months just arguing the RF impact benefits or consequences of putting a tower in grandma's backyard. Now the reality is these are lower powered, so instead of having 50 watts, they're 5 watts or 2 watts, so they're low powered, but there's still radio frequency radiation going on there. I know of one city that lost a city manager over her advocacy for a tower in a neighborhood where the neighborhoods band together. And ultimately, she's no longer there at the city, in part for many reasons, but in part because of the vigorous citizen opposition that came out as a result of concerns over RF radiation of the neighborhood. So, it's a tough question, and officially no, but in the court of public opinion, maybe.
You know what, Dave? I just got a comment from Drew. He said the EU has stated concerns with the effect of the wave RF on humans with high density requirements for 5G implementation. So I actually read an article on that too. So I guess keep posted and keep your eye out on the news. We did get two more questions. I'll try to sneak these in. One is from Amy. She said, can we backhaul our cost of service study into the non-franchise agreements that feed the fiber into the small cells?
Read that again, Chris. I'm sorry, from Amy.
Sure. She said, can we backhaul our cost of the service study into the non-franchise agreements that feed the fiber to the small cells?
Yes, that can be a little complicated. There should be a system valuation done, and a lot of it depends who paid for it going in, who owns it. Is it shared infrastructure? I wish there were an easy answer for Amy. And Amy, if you'd like to give one of us a call, we'd be glad to discuss that with you in some detail. There's probably 6 answers and 6 nuances to your question, so I'd be glad to talk to you offline. Give us a holler if you like, and we can kind of walk you through at least our perspectives on that. Great question. Again, beware the nuances, because there's no easy yes or no's. Blacks and whites don't really exist in this world.
Thanks, Dave. We have one more question, and then we will wrap it up. This one is from Peter, and he asks, he states, we will soon have fiber hanging on your utility light poles. I thought that connection points had to be determined in advance. How can you hook 3 to 5 antennas every 300 to 500 feet without predetermined connection points?
Again, Peter's got an excellent question there. So much depends on the technical layout, both the network architecture, the frequencies, and I think it was one of our listeners was talking about this millimeter wave frequency. So in the past, the typical frequency for a cell phone is 2 to 3 gigahertz. The new frequencies will be probably in the 30 to 40 gigahertz. So it's 10 times the frequency goes way up. That really drives a number of hard technical questions that talks about distances, spacing, who's on what frequency, who's on what pole. In fact, what we've seen, we were just asked by another client to illustrate to them one example of multiple small cells going on a single pole, a single camouflaged pole. And there are very few out there right now that we could really point to. 2 in the entire Los Angeles area is all that we could find. One's at the convention center, but that really is based on a coalition of the willing. So if most likely the cost to pop one of these poles up is much lower than the cost for one provider to deal with another provider and to go through 6 months of wrangling, no offense, Bart, of lawyering on both sides, get agreements between two cell phone companies to work together. That frankly doesn't happen a lot. And given the choice between, hey, for $5,000, I can go to City X, pop up a new standalone pole on that street corner, or for $20,000 and 6 months delay, I can get harassed and harangued by the other providers and try to work with them. And so the bottom line there is that these guys don't need to work with each other. They're in the business of blow and go, put these poles up and move on, get this deployment up there. They really don't care about aesthetics, working with each other, co-locating. They want to come in, put in 200 poles in a downtown area and be gone. And so the reality is really is that unless you take some action now to where you can control these with regulations, ordinances, rules you place out in advance, you may be wishing you had taken some advantages and been proactive in the future. Strongly, again, another foot stopper is put some rules in place quickly.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you for our participants and all the great questions we got. Recording of today's session will be emailed to you today. It'll also provide our contact information, or you could just reply to the email. I will be fielding those replies, so if you do have any other questions, feel free to just send me an email, and I will make sure that someone will get back to you in a timely manner and follow up with you. We'd like to thank you again all for joining us today, and thanks to Bart Miller, George Wentz, and Dave Zelnock for the great presentation and discussion. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.